And before we knew it, we were in the middle of a lesson.
You have to keep your ward up, or else this won't work. I don't want to hurt you.
I don't want you to hurt
Over
me.
there, please.
And that did not go well, let me tell you that for nothing. But it keeps Chapter 4 of the Leonard playthrough caught me by surprise, both in how it started and indeed how it ended up playing out. I'd always imagined that the college questline would require a little finessing to get Leonard involved and to make it, workable, to make it entertaining. But in fact, the opposite was true. It was quite possibly one of the easiest chapters I made. It really did flow. It wrote itself, so to speak. Once I'd established that Leonard was there basically to rob the mages of relics if they found any, and that he was just hanging around pretending to be a student, the whole thing just worked. If you don't mind me stealing the meme, it did. It just worked. I didn't really have to think very hard about what was going on. I could just go with the questline, do what I was supposed to do, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was relaxing. And as strange as it might seem, because at the time, let's face it, Leonard had more or less no magical ability whatsoever, that chapter almost felt like the most Leonard-like chapter I could come up with. He was out of his depth, doing something he was completely uncomfortable with, and he was a total fraud. He was scheming, he was faking it, and he was doing all of this for the opportunity to see if he could acquire something of value to himself. Now this chapter ends with Leonard becoming the Archmage of the college, which is of course pretty ridiculous because he's still a fairly useless mage. At best you'd say he was a substandard novice when it came to spellcasting. But this was the chapter where the seeds for the changes that would occur in Leonard were planted. This was where he did learn the basics of magic, and he was, towards the end of that chapter, using certain spells reasonably frequently. Now granted, they were the most Leonard-like spells you could imagine. I mean, most mages want to throw fireballs, raise the dead, summon Dremora, that sort of thing. Leonard wanted a light so he could see stuff, yeah? Leonard wanted clairvoyance so he could find the stuff he was supposed to find. And of course this trend did continue throughout the whole playthrough, where Leonard would find spells that were useful to him where possible. Repel rain, a magical umbrella that keeps him dry. Again, one of the most Leonard ways of using magic you could possibly imagine. This was also the chapter where I think I really tried to establish a more believable way of learning things like magic for Leonard. I mean, we all know that the Dragonborn hero can just pretty much pick up a book, just look at it and learn the spell. It doesn't matter where he is. He could be up the top of a mountain, he could be at the bottom of the sea, and he could just take the book out, glance at it, and he now knows the spell. I did not want that for Leonard, so you'll probably have noticed throughout that chapter Leonard tended to need to spend time at the college to learn a spell, and there would be a passage of time. He would spend some time discussing with one of the teachers, some time reading the book, etc, etc. I also did the same anytime he wanted to learn a perk, or most times he wanted to learn a perk. If it felt magical in nature, he would go off and speak to the instructor. So I wanted to make it feel like Leonard did have to go through a learning process, even if you still acknowledge it's a pretty fast learning process. It's just not the instant process we're used to with Skyrim. But I actually extended that to other areas later on in future chapters. So for example, when Leonard needed to smelt metal, what I did is I had him go off and find a smith who would train him, would teach him, and I would pay him a little money, and I would imagine that he was teaching him how to smelt, and then time would pass and he'd be smelting and he'd be a little bit better at it, and he'd now have the metal he needed for, well, what was the museum quest at the time. And sticking with the theme of believable learning, I have to say some of the mods I used really did help with this chapter. Obscure's Overhaul, the Tweaks mod that he made as well, the Interesting College NPCs mod. These mods really made the college feel a lot more believable. They made it twice as big for a start, they filled it with more students, so you did get this actual sensation of being at college where people were learning things. It had the teachers in lecture rooms that they would teach you in if you went and visited them. There was a timetable posted on a notice board, so there really was this great feeling of being on a campus and learning. So those mods really did help make that chapter believable, but also a lot more fun. And of course, Inigo occasionally whistles the Harry Potter theme music whilst there, so there's that too. Chapter 5. Unlocking the Dragons.
I need your help again.
Whatever it
I want
is.
you to go with Irileth and help her fight this dragon.
Except that this was not something that I really wanted to do, but there is a fair amount of content that relies on you progressing the main quest to a certain point. And this includes some of the quests in the museum. I'd been told that the excavation quests that you go on with the Explorers Guild really don't start until you've done the first dragon fight, so I kind of had to at least get that far. I also felt like Leonard really had to go to Whiterun and try and become the Thane there. It was the obvious choice for him now, and delaying it any further would have just seemed a little weird. But even though I was going to unlock the dragons, I wanted to make sure that there was no way Leonard could kill a dragon, at least not by himself. So I installed Deadly Dragons and I cranked the settings up to absolutely ridiculous. I mean, I started on the insane setting and then I just cranked everything up so that pretty much a single bite from the dragon would kill Leonard. The dragon fire from the dragon's breath would kill him in less than a second if he didn't have resists, and it would probably take him about a week to kill the dragon, even if the dragon came down, sat there and let Leonard hit them pretty much non-stop. I wanted Leonard to have zero chance against the dragons, so that the only way he could kill the dragon in that first quest is basically by letting the Whiterun guards and Inigo kill it for him. Because to me, that was the most Leonard way of fighting a dragon. Let everyone else do it. Now you might be thinking, but how on earth were you going to progress the main quest if you couldn't fight dragons? I mean, you weren't going to be able to take the Whiterun guards with you for all of the other dragon fights. And the answer to that question is, I wasn't intending to fight any more dragons. That's right. I was not planning on continuing the main quest in Chapter 5. I had intended to go and visit the Greybeards, find out that I'm the Dragonborn, yada yada yada, have an encounter with the cultists that Mirax sent, and then go to Solstheim. Yep, that's right. My original plan for Chapter 5 was to play the Dragonborn DLC. And of course, that did not happen, so we've got another one of those total failures where the Let's Play gets completely out of my control and things go horribly wrong. Although in this case, it actually involved me having to reload to an earlier save and just go in a completely different direction. Now, you might be thinking at this point, but wait a minute, Gopher, you said you didn't want to fight dragons, but there are dragons in the Dragonborn DLC and you've got to fight some of them. Yeah, I'd kind of forgotten that. Believe it or not, I've only ever played the Solstheim DLC before I played it with Leonard one time, and that was with Richard. It's one of the few things in Skyrim that I've only ever played once. and I'd sort of got vague memories of travelling around Solstheim and doing many things, and I do remember sort of fighting Miraak at some point, but I'd forgotten a lot of the interim stages where you actually have to fight dragons. There are dragons for you to fight. So I had forgotten that, but that's not actually why the whole thing fell apart, believe it or not. In actual fact, the whole thing fell apart after some NPC I was having a conversation with in Raven Rock said something that jogged my memory. That's right, I actually got as far as Solstheim when I originally recorded Chapter 5. I had the encounter with Miraak's cultists, and shortly afterwards, I took the boat from Windhelm to Solstheim, and I got off the boat and had a few conversations. And one of the conversations I had was asking someone whether they'd heard of the name Miraak, and they mentioned the stone. You know, the stone where everyone was working at night? And as soon as they said that, my brain did that thing it did just before Chapter 4 started. It filled in all of the details of what was going to happen for the rest of this quest. My memory had been jogged, and I suddenly remembered more or less all the pertinent details of the Dragonborn DLC quest, and I remembered something with absolute horror, and that something was the Bend Will Shout. Now at this point, there is probably yet more confusion occurring because the Bend Will Shout is generally considered to be one of the more useless shouts in Skyrim. I mean, yes, technically you can control things that are not dragons, but overall, you generally just kill them. And yes, it can control a dragon, which is very useful in the main quest of the Dragonborn DLC, but outside of that, who cares? Oh, so you can use it to travel somewhere. What, like a carriage or a horse? I mean, okay. And you're not going to actually use it on a dragon anyway, because when you find a dragon, you want to use Dragon Rend on it, get it down on the ground, and kill it in the face so you can take its soul and its bones and its scales, right? I mean, that's what you do in Skyrim. You don't look at a dragon and think, oh my god, that's a horrific flying monster. You think, ooh, loot! Yeah, so Bend Will is kind of useless. But here's the thing. The Bend Will Shout is actually massively, insanely powerful if you just think about this from a story perspective. I mean, again, I know the dragons in vanilla Skyrim are somewhat underwhelming, but they're supposed to be the creatures of legend. And a man that can control dragons is pretty much a demigod. This was a huge, enormous, massive, unbearable power spike for Leonard. And this is especially true when you consider that I had made the dragons actually truly epic as they should be. Give him a shout that lets him control them? Well, first of all, that removes one of the advantages to unlocking the dragons. I mean, unlocking the dragons did come with some disadvantages to me, but one of the advantages is now there's a creature in Skyrim that terrifies Leonard and he has no tools to face, so he has to run and hide from it. It's another one of those he's out of his comfort zone areas. But with the Bend Will Shout, well, he just controls the dragon, but then he has a dragon under his control. Leonard. Leonard. Think of Leonard. Leonard, who can control dragons. Chapter 5. Think about what that would mean for the entire series. Think of the tools, the powers, the skills that he developed in chapters 6 and 7. Would he have done that? Had he the ability to control people's minds with a single shout? How would he have approached the Civil War if he could control dragons? I mean, would he have even got involved in the Civil War? He was doing that just to become the Thane of Windhelm. Would he have still had the same aim if he could control dragons? He might. I mean, he is a pretty obsessive character, and that was one of the Thane ships he was missing, and he is the sort of person who wants the complete set. The point is, from a story perspective, Bend Will is such a power spike, it would have made a lot of what happened in later chapters almost irrelevant. All of the changes, the progress, the growth that Leonard had, well, not as a person, because his personality didn't really change, but his tool set changed and grew over time, and it was a lot of fun doing that. That would have all become pretty irrelevant, as would have a lot of his goals. They would have felt a bit superfluous, and, you know, I didn't want that at this point. This was just too big of a power spike. So I'm stood there in Solstheim realizing, oh wow, this can't happen. In fact, that was when I realized the Dragonborn DLC had to pretty much be the last chapter of Leonard's official story arc, because after that point, Leonard would be a very, very different character. Of course, unfortunately, I'd already released the prelude for the chapter, and so everyone knew what was coming next, and so I had a bit of a dilemma. I had to decide what to do, and my only real option was to actually reload a slightly earlier save to just before I decided to come to Solstheim and carry on with the main quest itself. There was a possibility that the museum quest line would open up and, you know, I could follow that, but generally speaking, those quests are very slow burn, and they happen over a period of time, and of course I didn't know it at this exact moment, but they stall at a point where you have to face 2 dragons, and if I'd set it up so Leonard had a problem with 1 dragon, he was definitely going to have a problem with 2. I briefly considered trying to start Dawnguard DLC again, only my brain was now functioning correctly and it had remembered Durnavir. Same problem really. Well, not exactly the same problem, a similar problem, not quite as bad. I'll talk about that more in the next video though. But the important thing is I continued on with the main quest, realizing I had 2 new problems. The first problem was one of my own making. I had made it so that Leonard couldn't kill dragons, at least not in the traditional way. He pretty much had to involve a bunch of the Whiterun soldiers to get that 1 dragon killed, and without them there is absolutely no way he would have managed to take that dragon down. So I needed to solve that problem first. Now, I wasn't sure if dragons could be poisoned. I'd never actually tried it before, so I had to go off and do a fair amount of testing. Turns out you can poison dragons. In fact, they're not actually that resistant to poisons, so with poisons as strong as Leonard's, he could actually take a dragon down, I wouldn't say easily, but with a lot less fuss than you'd imagine. Now, they couldn't be paralysed, whether with magic or poison, and that's a relief because that would have trivialised the dragon fights massively. But it did mean Leonard could kill dragons. I just didn't want him killing dragons that easily. Now, in Deadly Dragons, you can crank up the armor resistance, the armor rating, which I did, and that makes it so that arrows and swords do very little damage on dragons, and you can crank up the magic resistance so that fire and ice does very little damage to them. But poison, there was no slider for this. I do know in a later update, Deadly Dragons added some poison resistance, but at the time I don't think it did. But even after it added the poison resistance, it still wouldn't have been enough to basically make Leonard's poisons anything other than pretty damn deadly against a dragon. And I just did not want that to be the case. I did need Leonard to be able to kill the dragon, but I didn't want to trivialize the fight. So I ended up having to make my own mod that added some resistance to poison to every dragon in the game. And whilst it was a very simple mod to make, it took several days to get it balanced correctly, because if the setting was too low, Leonard would kill the dragon in 5 to 10 minutes. If it was too high, I'd get the message, you cannot poison this dragon. And so I was tweaking it by a percent here and a percent there, and I was having to summon various different dragons, including the quest ones. And I essentially was looking to make the dragon fights last 20 minutes, half an hour. I wanted them to be painful. I wanted them to be dangerous. I wanted them to be something that Leonard would avoid in all circumstances where possible, but still doable. Now, of course, that did make some of the dragon fights a little long and tedious for the viewers, and I ended up trying to cut the fights down in the video editing process. I wanted the fight to take 20 minutes, half an hour, but of course, I can do that maybe once or twice for the viewer, but once you've got the idea that these fights are going to be very long and involve an awful lot of hiding behind objects and just peeking out and shooting with an arrow, desperately hoping you don't get fire to the face, once you've got that concept, you don't need it hammering home every single solitary dragon fight. So I started to cut and edit the dragon fights down, hopefully to, more viewable portions, while still keeping the feeling of an epically long battle that, Leonard would definitely rather have avoided. So that was the first problem solved, mostly. But what was the second problem? The second problem was I didn't know how to end the chapter. Ordinarily, what I'm looking for is either something that is a very obvious end or a very obvious beginning for something else. And no new beginnings were presenting themselves, and the only logical end with the main quest is the death of Alduin, and that was the very last thing I wanted, because let's face it, if Leonard could kill Alduin, it's pretty much over. Everything just changes at that. If he had the power to stop the World Eater, that's going to be even more game-changing than Bend will. Especially seeing as at this point, if he's defeated Alduin, he will have embraced his Dragonborn nature. Just think about what that means for a character like Leonard, especially considering Leonard's personality, but also consider the way Leonard introduced himself.
Who are you?
Lenny. It's short for Leonard? Leonard Tiberius Septim. Yeah, that's right. No relation, obviously. That would be, you never know, I suppose. You know what these nobles are like, right? And no, before you ask, I am not suggesting that Leonard is, in fact, part of the Septim dynasty, even if that is possible, even if the official accounts are somewhat wrong as to the demise of that dynasty. It's pretty unlikely that Leonard is in fact related. All I want to say on that subject is, in actual fact, Leonard's ancestry is, shall we say, uncertain. Yeah? It's a subject that has no definitive answer at this current moment, but I have to say it's unlikely that that answer would be that Leonard is in fact a blood relative of the Septims. However, this is Leonard we're talking about. When has the truth got in the way of anything for Leonard? The Imperial records clearly document a man bearing the name Septim entering Skyrim, being arrested, turning out to be the Dragonborn, the chosen of Akatosh. The Blades swear fealty to him, well, depending on what he does, and he goes on to save the world by defeating the World Eater. I think you can all guess Leonard's next move, yeah? You know Leonard is going to be milking that one for all he can get, and he's probably not going to be looking at things like the Thainship of Windhelm, etc., etc. He's going to be, you know, looking for bigger fish, so to speak. So I definitely wanted to find a place to exit that quest line before we got to Alduin. But luckily for me, Leonard being Leonard, an opportunity did present itself sometime later. Dragon!
What? No!
Okay, I think we lost it. I think we lost it. Guys, I got some pretty bad news. I'm afraid, I have a feeling your leader, Parthenax, has been eaten by a dragon.
Where do you want to go?
Anything to declare? Yeah, don't play with dragons. Chapter 6. Yet another chapter that should have been very difficult to make a character like Leonard work in, and yet somehow I feel like that chapter is yet another example of Leonard being quintessential Leonard. Do you even Thane, bro? The Civil War. Pitched battles in the streets of cities, in forts, direct combat with other men-at-arms at your side. Nothing could be less Leonard than that. But of course that was exactly what he had to go through if he wanted to become the Thane of Windhelm. And yet again, it just worked so well for me because it's Leonard out of his depth, out of his comfort zone, faking it. Making it up as he goes along and hoping that nobody notices. That's how he did the entire quest line. He sort of would stand at the back waving his sword and saying to the men, "Forward, charge!" and then somehow always managed to be at the back when they were charging. He hit upon the genius plan of pretending to be a battle mage, throwing fear and rage spells around. Strangely enough, it's one of those weird situations where you could say fake it till you make it is actually appropriate because he was pretending to be a battle mage, but he was also being a battle mage at the same time. And so once again, this chapter didn't really pose many problems for me. It was relatively straightforward. I say no problems. There was one issue, but it was nothing to do with the story or Leonard and everything to do with Skyrim crashing, basically. There was this strange bug. I say strange bug. There was this bug that caused a crash to desktop whenever I approached one of the 3 camps that were set up during that quest line. If you remember the camps where Legate Rika hangs around and you go and you get the assignments to go off and investigate or attack a fort, those camps, at a certain point in that quest line, if I approached those camps, as I transitioned into the cell where that camp was, my game would simply crash. It was either that or the cell beforehand. Whenever that cell was loading, it would crash. Now luckily there was a way around this because I did think, oh maybe it's a mod, and I started uninstalling all my mods and nothing I uninstalled stopped the problem at all. Of course that doesn't always mean that it's not caused by the mod. It might be a problem that's now baked into the save. But I'm also wondering if this is a problem that does hit the vanilla game occasionally and a lot of people don't notice it because the solution was pretty simple. I could fast travel to the area. That did not cause a crash. It only crashed if I, travelled by horse or on foot from one place to the camp. If I fast travelled too close to the camp, so the camp was loaded in, I could go to it, no problem. So what I ended up having to do is every time I got close to the camp, I'd made sure I had autosave on just in case it crashed too early. But if I knew it was going to crash, I knew I was approaching the border, I'd simply stop the video. I would fast travel a very short distance so I was within the zone where the camp was, and then travel onwards towards the final distance to the camp and continue the recording. So basically it made it feel seamless. I hope you guys didn't notice it. I was worried that the bug was going to persist once the Civil War questline was over. That was a very real worry. But each time the camp moved, the area where the old camp was became bug free. So, you know, it could have just been something, some item that was part of the camp. It could have been an item caused by a mod. It could have been a piece of armor from one of the armor mods. It could have been anything. But whatever it was, there was a solution to get around it. And once that bit of the quest finished, that area was cleared up. So it was a little bit of a problem, but in the end, it was manageable. So that's it. Chapter 6 ends, indeed, Phase 2 of the Leonard story ends with him finally becoming the Thane of everywhere. His plan to gain influence in polite society amongst the nobles, the merchants, the intellectuals is complete. He has properties throughout Skyrim, with the sole exception of Winterhold, because there's no house there, really. There's not many houses there. But he has the college, and he's got a great place at the top of the tower. So he has everything he set out to get when he first arrived in Skyrim. And yet, he still wants more.